Hello members and good evening. I'm Anna from the Tastings and Events team at the Wine Society. Delighted to be joined this evening by my colleagues Tim and Gil behind the scenes from the Tastings team too, and also Tim Sykes, our buyer for Bordeaux. As part of a series of events celebrating our Bordeaux en Primeur campaign, we are thrilled to welcome Veronique of Château Haut-Bailly this evening. And before I hand over to Tim, for a formal introduction, I will just share with you a few gentle reminders on how we like to use Zoom here at the Wine Society. For those of you brand new to our events, then please do have a look at the bottom of our email invitations. We have some instructions on how to use Zoom for webinars, different screens, etc. But really the key points are that if you want to ask a question of Veronique and Tim, please do use the Q&A button. You'll find that at the top of your device or the bottom of your device, depending on what you're using, but it's very, very obvious, a nice big Q&A button. We are going to make time for questions at the end. And if you have a technical problem, you can of course use the chat to @the Tastings team, but you can also email. Those tend to be a bit easier, so tastings@thewinesociety.com if you want to send us an email if you're having trouble tonight. So I do hope that you have a glass of something delicious to hand. I'm very excited. It's a bit of a grey evening here. I can see somebody is in a sunny Suffolk, sorry. Well, it's a little grey here, but I tell you, this wine has already brightened up my evening. So I've got my glass charged. I'm excited to hear from Veronique. And so I'm going to introduce Tim Sykes. Good evening, Tim.
Good evening, Anna, and welcome everybody. Yes, I have a glass as well in front of me, which I will introduce as the webinar goes on. But I'm delighted to welcome Veronique Sanders, who is the Chief Executive of Château Haut-Bailly in the Grave. I've known Veronique for a number of years. Veronique has been the Chief Executive of, I think, for 20 years, is it, Veronique?
Even more, actually.
Even more. But actually, Veronique's been involved with Haut-Bailly for a lot longer than 20 years because her family owned the chateau for many years. So welcome, Veronique. And shall we maybe start with a little potted history of Haut-Bailly and who's owned it, and we can talk about the vineyards after that, maybe.
With pleasure, Tim. Thank you for this invitation tonight. So the history of Haut-Bailly is actually quite old because we found written tracks of the existence of vines in the 13th century. And we know that vines were already there probably in the 12th century. So it's been a long time that we are making wine on this estate. And you had a few golden ages at Haut-Bailly. One of them was when Firmin Le Bailly, a Parisian banker, fell in love with the existing vines in 1630 and gave his name to the estate. So that was really the starting point under the name of Haut-Bailly. And then even a few women were active in the 18th century in a very dynamic way. And we had to wait for Alcide Belot des Minières in 1872 for another brilliant golden age. The man was an engineer. He had made his fortune in America, and he came back to Bordeaux and put all his science and his money into the estate. He was convinced that the terroir of Haut-Bailly was exceptional. He called his wine nectars, and he was able to sell the wines of Haut-Bailly at the same price as the first growth during almost 70 years, between 1872 and 1940. So that was really a terrific time in the history of Haut-Bailly. We suffered from the economic crisis of the 30s, the Second World War, and if you remember, after the Second World War, all of Bordeaux could be bought for nothing. I was discussing that with my grandmother a few weeks ago, and she was telling me that actually, if you were buying an estate, you had to know it was to inject money every year. So you really needed to have a certain motivation to do so. And that's what my great-grandfather, Daniel Sanders, did in 1955, because he purchased HautBailly for probably nothing at that time. He ran it until my grandfather, Jean, started in 1979. He was very fond of the wine society. He was always telling me beautiful things about the wine society. And my grandfather ran it until 98, when we sold the estate to an American banker, Bob Wilmers, whose father actually was English. And I've been running this estate for Bob. Bob passed away, unfortunately, in December 2017, but it is now the second generation of the family who is in charge.
You, I believe, are that. So you're the fourth generation from the Sanders family to be involved with HautBailly, I think. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
And when your great-grandfather bought the estate in the 50s, I think I'm right in saying that it was quite a bit smaller and the vineyards were not in terribly good shape. Is that right?
Well, actually, nothing was in good shape, because just after the Second World War, it was very difficult. And he bought in 1955. And just after that, you had the big frost of 1956. Yes. So fortunately, what we call the old vines of HautBailly were not touched and were preserved, but lots of plantation had to be redone. And then, you know, we always wait 3 years after we pulled out something. So we've been planting lots of things in 59, and those plantations actually are giving us beautiful grapes today. But when you buy an estate and you have to replant everything from the beginning, this is a tough beginning, I have to say.
Yes, yes,
yeah,
absolutely. So maybe we can put up a picture of, I think we've got a map just showing where HautBailly is in the Grave. So you can see from the map of France in the top right-hand corner where Bordeaux is. I think most people will know that. But more specifically, if you see the main map, you can see the cursor on where HautBailly is in relation to the town of Bordeaux. So it's just south of the town of Bordeaux. But the area is Pessac-Léognan, Veronique, but Pessac-Léognan hasn't been around as a name for an appellation for that long, has it? It's about 20 years or something?
Yes, Pessac-Léognan was created in 1987. So it's a relatively new appellation. And it's not only Pessac and Léognan, you have a few other villages which belong to this appellation, like Martillac, for example, or Cadeaujac. What you should know also is that Bordeaux belongs to the region of the Grave. So we are really at the doors of Bordeaux, southwest. It's 10 kilometers literally from the city center of Bordeaux. So we are extremely lucky, because it's a very countryside landscape, but extremely close from the train station and the airport in Bordeaux, which makes it a fantastic place to work and live. Yes.
Yeah. And I think I'm right in saying, I think we've got another map which drills down into the actual vineyard. Now, this is maybe talk us through this map and how the vineyards have changed over the years in terms of HautBailly's ownership of vineyards.
Yes, what is quite rare in Bordeaux is that we have a single block estate around the chateau, which almost didn't change size in 4 centuries. So that's very, very uncommon. And that's, of course, a gage for quality, the testimony of quality. What you see on this picture is the vineyard when it was owned by Alcide Bello des Minières, and you see it on the, you see the man. You see also that we have the heart of the vineyard is only vines, and in front of the chateau you have what we call the all vines. Bello des Minières had a special recipe to make HautBailly, and we still have it actually as he planted it. You all know that we make blend wines in Bordeaux, but you probably don't know that in the past, the blend was done in the field. So the old vines of Bello des Minières were planted with a special recipe, which was 1/12 of Merlot, 1/12 of Carmenère, 1/12 of Malbec, 1/12 of Cabernet Franc, and 1/12 of Petit Verdot, and 7/12 of Cabernet Sauvignon. So these 6 different grape varieties are still mixed in front of the chateau with vines which are 100, 125 years old. So that's very rare, very special. It's the heart of the Grand Vin every single year. And we try to preserve it as long as we can. And when one vine is dead, we just replace it by the same grape variety. So this is quite unique to have that. All of the place of the property now is planted under vine, but you also had time, and you can see that you have pine trees planted. You also have time where you could make more money with pine trees than with vines. So it's an interesting map to understand the history of Bordeaux and of the wines of Bordeaux.
So you have about 30 hectares planted, of which, is it 4 hectares is the really old 120-year-old vines?
Yes, yes. Just in the middle.
How do you identify which vines are which? Because presumably if you've got 6 varieties of old vines, they all ripen at different times. So you presumably need to go through the vineyard several times at harvest.
Yes, this is a very good question. My grandfather used to harvest everything at once because he was thinking that the tiny difference of maturity didn't damage anything and was actually brought some complexity, and he made beautiful wines without sorting it. But in 2000, I started to sort out the old vines, and just with the team of HautBailly, we've been picking the early grape varieties, and then 10 days later, we harvested the late grape varieties. Since 2001, in order to be able to keep the pickers, when we do that, we mark each vine at the veraison, the change of color, in August, to know if it will be an early or a late grape variety. And we do it every year because according to the weather of the summer, certain grape varieties can go in a group or in the other group. So it's very precise. It shows you actually the level of precision we work at HautBailly.
But these 4 hectares make a significant difference to the Grand Vin, to the HautBailly, because presumably most of the 4 hectare fruit from those 4 hectares goes into the Grand Vin. Is that right?
Oh yes, it's really every year. It's a heart of HautBailly. It's always the most powerful, complex, and dense wine when we make the blends. And what is amazing is that those old vines, they probably don't produce very much. Let's say 35 hectoliters per hectare on average, but they are always there. Whatever the vintage is, they will produce something fantastic. So that's really something special to have those.
And if you had to, I'm sure a lot of people who are watching tonight will know your wines very well, Veronique, but others will be less familiar with the wines. If you had to kind of sum up the HautBailly style, how would you best describe the wines to somebody who maybe hasn't tried them before?
Well, we are a classified wine from the Grave area, so you know all about the elegance of the wines in the Grave. HautBailly is famous, first of all, for its consistency. Whatever the vintage is, we will perform very well. It's easy to make a great wine in a great vintage, less easy to make it in a more challenging vintage. Normally, you're never disappointed with a HautBailly, whatever the vintage is. And in terms of style, it's a wine which is extremely silky. The tannins are very soft and almost velvety, creamy in certain vintages, but silky is the right word. So there's nothing aggressive in our wine. You have a beautiful balance. It's very long. It has a great aging ability. And I know that in England, you probably don't drink HautBailly before it's 20 or 25 years old. And that's why I always love to come to England. Your cellars are older than ours. So it's all about elegance, freshness, smooth power, but delicacy at the same time, you see.
Yeah. Finesse is a word that often appears in my tasting notes for your wine, Veronique, because I think your wines have real kind of very lovely grainy tannins and lovely finesse. So they are wines that keep well, but actually they are wines that increasingly you can drink younger if you like the style of wine, relatively vibrant. Is that fair?
Definitely. I think since few years, the way we work, the way we vinify, let us produce wines which are drinkable much younger than what we used to do in the past. And I'm fascinated to taste the young wines and you just open the cork and drink it. It's and it doesn't mean that it won't age, because very often people ask us, if you can drink it earlier, does that mean that it won't age as long as it should be? And it's not true at all. We are building vintages. I'm thinking of the 2009, 2010, 2015, 16. Those wines are built to last a century, but you can really start enjoying them much earlier that you should have done a few years ago with great vintage.
Now we have a slide which I asked specifically to be put into the pack for tonight, and it's an old poster which I first saw when I think it was the first time I visited you, Veronique, and I love this poster. Is this from the 20s or the 30s or something?
It's from 1903, actually.
Oh, 1903. I'm way out. Maybe you'd like to explain what it is.
Yes, it was under the time of Bello des Minières, and it was the first page of a beautiful book called Les Grands Vins de la Gironde. So probably one of the first book about wine. It's really an amazing book, and you have the story of each chateau page by page. But the first page of the book is actually the top 8 of Bordeaux at the beginning of the 20th century. And you're right, because you have other editions which have been published a bit later than 1903. But this picture comes from my edition in 1903. So you see in the middle Yquem, of course, which was and is the first of the first. And then you have Lafite, Latour, Margaux, Aubryon, Ozone, and 2 outsiders. One is Mouton Rothschild, and the other one, Haut-Bailly, with the mention of Cru Exceptionnel. And it was just reflecting actually the positioning of Haut-Bailly at that time. And when I show this book, I always show also the price list from Nicolas. The shops we have in France, and then you can actually see that the level of price of Haut-Bailly was just at the same price as the first growth. So it was really an amazing time for Haut-Bailly at that time.
You discovered something about this poster relatively recently, which you were explaining to me about an addition. Maybe there's a certain chateau that seems to have been added on later. Is that right?
Yes, actually, we have another edition, and you can probably see it on the picture. Mouton Rothschild was actually added later. So you have another edition from before, where we were only 7. So that's a funny thing.
So Mouton has been pasted on effectively late in the day.
Yes.
Okay, well let's move on to the next slide, because the last time I visited you was in 2019. It was the day after the harvest finished, and Veronique obviously on the left, and the gentleman on the right will be familiar to many of you. He's Steve Finlan, our chief executive, and I took Steve out to Bordeaux right at the end of the 19 harvest, and the idea was that Steve was going to accompany each of the buyers to get an understanding of how we work and the relationships we have with various chateaus. Well, I'm delighted that Steve joined me for that trip, but obviously with COVID, he hasn't actually managed to do any more trips. So I think he's absolutely raring to go when travel does actually begin to be allowed again. But there's one thing that we should talk about, which is on the left-hand side of the previous photo, and you can see it in the background here, is a modern-looking building, and I think we really need to talk about that, Veronique.
Yes, it's actually our new cellars. And the concept is beautiful because lots of people always say that the vineyard at HautBailly is a garden and is treated as a garden. And the architect heard that. And being located on the highest point of the appellation, he just actually made the garden fly up or fly away. So we have a place at HautBailly which is a bit higher than where we were today, and it's like if you had cut the garden actually and introduced the cellar underneath, and we digged 10 meters down. So it's very deep, it's very large. We have big volume to work, a lovely working space that we never had before, but it's completely integrated into the environment and you don't see it. This picture was made in the winter time, just at the end of the construction, so it's not reflecting exactly what it will be, and we'll make new picture in June, but you don't see it actually. So it's beautiful because we didn't want to take out the soul and the spirit of the place and keeping the chateau, which is this 19th century building, in the middle of it. But we wanted to keep also the team united, working in the center of the estate. So we resolve all that, maintaining the privacy of the chateau, having the team working in the central place, without seeing any circulation. Everything is underneath. And this is actually the tasting room that you are looking at. And the tasting room has an amazing view. And I'm usually there every day with people or for some Zoom. And I'm watching a painting. It's absolutely gorgeous because I can look at the vines, I can look at the cellar, and of course I see the chateau. So it's just a beautiful painting, and the garden is changing by the day. So you can see every season. It's really an amazing spirit that the architect was able to catch. Keeping the environmental aspects, bringing it inside. So it has lots of qualities that we use for the inside. And it's a beautiful tool, a technical tool that will help us to make even more precise and better wines, actually.
I mean, the interior looks absolutely phenomenal, because I know, I mean, having tasted in the previous cellar, I know it's a little, almost a rabbit warren of lots of smaller rooms with tanks, and it must be very difficult for the winemaking team, or it was very difficult for the winemaking team to organize everything. But this looks absolutely perfect in terms of organization, and you have everything you need to maximize the potential of HautBailly.
Yes, the previous cellars dated probably from the 16th century. So every 20 or 30 years, we would adapt them to what's new. But it was just permanent adaptation. With these cellars, we started from scratch. So we had a white page, and we knew exactly what we wanted in order to do better, you know. So it was fantastic. It was a fantastic construction, fantastic project, and lots of people are coming to visit it now because we enter the 21st century in a way which is brilliant, you know, with all the new technology that you dream to have to handle things in the best condition.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing it. I saw it in its construction, but I haven't seen the finished article. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing it. And you do actually, you take visitors, don't you, at HautBailly? I know you've got some guest accommodation and access to a restaurant as well. So, but for members who are able eventually to start traveling again, it's probably worth mentioning about the accommodation at Château Haut-Bailly.
Yes, we bought another estate next door, Château Le Pape, in 2012. We also did 3 years of renovation, and we opened the guest house in September 15. And we won a Golden Award for and we were nominated the best place to stay in Bordeaux, because basically you are at the doors of Bordeaux in the middle of a lovely vineyard, and you can see and enjoy the life of the vineyard, and it's very peaceful, so people love it. The concept is that you just live in a chateau in the vineyard. And at HautBailly we also have our own chef who can cook for you. So it's not really a restaurant, but it's a private table. So it's very exclusive. You need to book in advance, but he cooks wonderfully well, and people love it. Yeah.
Sounds very, very enticing, I have to say. Now, the winery was not actually completed in time for the 2020 vintage, was it?
No, it should have been, actually. We were supposed to complete it in June, but with COVID, we had some delay, and the vintage was actually 3 weeks ahead of time, 3 weeks in advance. So mid-August, we decided to reopen our previous cellar and not take any risk. And we vinified for one last time in our old cellars. But we brought the wines of 2020 in October down in the cellar, in the new cellar, in order for them to be aged and blended in the new cellar. So we are actually working in the new cellar since October, when we received the construction.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us rather neatly onto the question of 2020. Obviously, the En Primeur campaign is just getting underway. You haven't released your wines yet, but I think members would be interested to hear what you make of the 2020 vintage, Veronique.
Well, the 2020 vintage was an incredible story made of unprecedented challenge. Of course, we had to handle all the climatic conditions, which are always more extreme. And the last 3 vintage were done in a way that surprised me, because when I started, I was told you'll make a great vintage with an easy year. And actually the last 3 vintage were not easy, and we always made beautiful wines as a result. So funny. So climatic conditions, and also of course sanitary conditions, had to be we had to deal with. And it's really a vintage that you can dedicate to the team who's been working all year long, 7 days a week, when everybody stayed at home under lockdown. So it's nice to see that dedication, passion, motivation were gratified by a beautiful result. So basically, it's an early and sunny vintage, which started in a very wet year in the spring, but turned out with a drought in the summer, and then exceptional conditions for the harvest. So it's a vintage where we have smaller yields than in 2019. The berries were smaller, very concentrated, but absolutely beautiful. So for me, it's quite interesting, because it's a marriage of power and elegance. And this is 2 things that I should normally not marry, you know. So you have big density, amazing black colors, but a beautiful elegance, and of course, a lovely freshness. So it makes a blend which is extremely interesting. And I think it's the third wine in a trilogy, which is extremely interesting.
Yes, well, I mean, you very kindly sent me samples to taste of HautBailly and the second wine, HautBailly 2, which actually is what I'm drinking tonight, although I'm drinking the 14 vintage of what used to be called La Parde HautBailly, and is now called HautBailly 2. But I think, Veronique, you've got the 14 Grand Vin.
Absolutely, I got the 14 Grand Vin.
I can't afford the Grand Vin, so I bought the second wine, but it's very delicious, I have to say.
Well, the second wines of today are the Grand Vin of yesterday. So.
Yes, that's true, actually. That is true. So just to come back to the 2020 vintage, so I've tasted quite extensively, and you know, I've read the weather reports and that kind of thing, and clearly it was a very hot, dry summer. There was virtually no rain, it would appear to me, between kind of mid-June and and the end of July. And yet the wines don't taste as if they're from a hot vintage particularly. How do you think, well, how has HautBailly managed to maintain freshness in the wines? Because I did pick up freshness in the wine. There's no hint of heat or drought.
No, I think first of all, freshness is a characteristic of lots of wines of HautBailly. I remember having done a vertical tasting going back to 1916 with Denis Dubourdieu, and that was his conclusion. He really said all this vintage at the table were showing freshness, so this is something which belonged to the way we like to make wine. But we were helped, especially in this vintage, by the fact that we have lots of clay in our soil and subsoil, so which is unusual for the appellation. And the clay help to provide water regularly, smoothly, even when you have a drought. So it's definitely a vintage where the great terroir could perform extremely well, because we could handle the rain being on the hillock, so we have a natural drainage. We could handle the drought, and we also did a vinification without extracting too much. So very, very gentle extraction at a lower temperature than normal in order to preserve, the fruitiness and the freshness.
And would you say that the wines, my impression is that the wines have a very promising long future, because there is tannin there, but it's not muscular tannin, it's ripe tannin. But do you think the wines have the capacity to age very well?
Extremely well. When you look at the analytics of the 2020, it's actually a copy-paste of the analytics of 2010, which is the biggest wine we ever produced until 2020. So if you remember 2010, it was the highest in alcohol, great acidity, pH, everything was bigger than normal, So 2020 looks on numbers like that, although the style is very different. So it's not at all 2010, but it's definitely a big wine, which is built to last probably a century, but that you can almost drink today. When you're tasting it, you have this smoothness, this impression of sapidity, and it's a tactile wine which really please your palate.
And the plantings at HautBailly is it around 60% Cabernet Sauvignon and high 30s for Merlot? Is that right? So
yes.
And the 20 vintage, how does that compare with what you have planted? Do you have a higher proportion of any particular variety than normal this year?
No, we actually have 52% Cabernet Sauvignon. In certain vintages, we could have 60 or 70% Cabernet Sauvignon, but we had 2 weeks of very hot and dry wind just before the harvest. And this wind really concentrated the berries. So we harvested very small berries for the Cabernet. That's why the yields on the Cabernet were actually smaller than the yields on the Merlot. But I have to say that the Merlot were absolutely beautiful. And the Cabernet that we harvested before the rain, it started on the 25th of September, were just amazing. A little bit like in 98, if you remember, which was a great vintage for Pessac-Léognan, actually.
Very interesting. So I have tasted both your wines, as I say. For the benefit of members who are watching and are interested to buy Veronique's wines, and indeed interested to buy en primeur, maybe I'll just explain for a couple of minutes how we are doing the campaign this year. So what we are doing is we are offering the top 30, I think it's 35 wines or thereabouts, and HautBailly is one of those wines. We are offering the wines as they come out onto the market by way of individual email, and the wines will appear on our website, hopefully within a day maximum of the wines being released. and then we will close the offer in a couple of days or 3 days, and then depending, you know, how much wine I manage to get my hands on, because obviously it's a small vintage, then we will allocate the wines. And then, as usual, for the more modestly priced wines, which will include HautBailly 2, which I liked very much, and that will go into the main offer. And our main offer is a printed offer. Again, the wines will appear online, and we will keep that offer open for a couple of weeks and then close it, and then let members know if they've been successful. And you know, at the moment, I'm trying to get as much wine as I can to make sure that we satisfy as many members as possible. So the main offer will include about, I think it's about 90 wines. For those who would like to know which wines we will be offering, if you go onto our website, you will see the top wines that we're offering, of which HautBailly is one, but it's the usual suspects. It's the Moutons, and it's the Aubrions, and it's the, you'll see the range, but it's kind of the normal range of top wines that we tend to offer. And we've also posted a list of the wines that will appear in the main offer. Now, I haven't quite finished all my tastings, so that list of the main offer wines is subject to minor changes, but you will get an idea of the range of wines that we'll be offering. And then those wines will come out, the offer will come out probably at the beginning of July. We're very much dependent on when prices are released by the Chateau. So I have no control over that, but as soon as all the prices are out, then the offer will go out. There is one funny story I ought to tell you, but a few years ago, we were desperately waiting for all the prices to come in, and there was one price that hadn't come in, and that was the second wine of HautBailly. So I actually had to contact Veronique and plead with her to release her price for the second wine so that we could send our offer to the printer, and she very kindly agreed to do that. So I have recounted that story on many occasions, Veronique, and I have to say you did us a big favor that time.
You can never refuse anything to the Wine Society. That's something my grandfather taught me, and I'm happy to do.
Yes, well, I've looked back at old catalogues and brochures from the Wine Society from, you know, that go back many, many, many years, you know, well into the early part of the 20th century, and HautBailly appears in a lot of them. So the relationship goes back a very long way, I'm pleased to say. So I think that kind of concludes the main body of the event tonight. But obviously we want to keep back some time. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, Anna. Is that right?
There certainly are, Tim. You're always right. Yes, we've got lots of questions. But first, before I go into the questions, thank you, Veronique. That was really, really interesting, a beautiful history, and so excellently explained. You did mention the 1998 vintage, and we do have a member drinking that with us this evening. So he's obviously chosen the perfect vintage to be drinking along with for you tonight. We have got lots of questions, so I hope you don't mind, members, if I do group some of them together. But the first question is from Roger Brooker, and Roger asks, how do you select the wines or select the grapes for the HautBailly 2?
That's a very good question, because you have different ways of doing second wines. And let me tell you what we love to do at HautBailly regarding our philosophy on second wines. We don't have any dedicated plots for the second wines where we could produce higher yields, for example. We prefer to work the whole vineyards as if we would do only HautBailly every year. So it's really a concept that is important to understand, because the work in the field, in the vineyard, is identical for the Grand Vin and the second wine. And then we make the vinification also identical. And then we just try to work on the blend, select the best of the best for HautBailly, of course, and also wines which match with each other. Sometimes you have very strong characters and you need to bring something with more finesse into it. And we also make a selection for the second wine, as we have since 87, when the fashion of second wine started. We started to make a third wine. So we have a selection process also for the second wine. That is why I call the second wine of HautBailly a true second wine, because it's really made of identical grapes in the field and identical vinification. What we often do is that we try to find wine which have maybe not the aging potential that you can have for the Grand Vin in the second wine. And we put it in the second wine for a drinkability which comes sooner. But last week, I tasted La Part de HautBailly in 1986 and 1989. And I couldn't believe that the second wine from those vintages would still perform so well. So our second wine, I'm happy to say, is also aging for 25, 30, 35 years without any problem, which is a good sign.
That's a wonderful sign. Thank you so much, Veronique. I think that answered a couple of member questions there, so wonderful. I hope you don't mind, we'll stick on HautBailly too for just a couple more questions. Andrew Welsh has asked, why did you change the name?
Well, we changed the name because lots of people, when I was traveling, didn't really understood what was the meaning of La Part, and sometimes even couldn't pronounce it correctly. So sometimes I heard La Prade or Le Part or whatever. La Part was a name given by my great-grandfather to the second wine, and it was actually the name of a plot of vines carrying the name of an old grape variety of Bordeaux, La Part, La Pardotte. So, but it was not easy for anybody to understand what it was. So during many, many years, I was thinking of changing the name, but I didn't want to have, what everybody has. And we just found out that to call it number 2 was so easy, obvious, easy to understand. And I'm happy to say it's a huge success. So we changed the name from the 2018 vintage, and since then it's an even bigger success. So I'm happy to say it works.
Thank you very much. And Tim, I have a question for you, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I often do. I'm the voice of the members. Will we be offering HautBailly 2 in half bottles this year?
I don't think we will be, no. Actually, I was contacted by a member saying, why don't we do more large formats and half bottles? And the simple answer is that our systems are just not set up for that at the moment, because we offer 120 wines and we buy the same wine. What members may not know is we don't buy the wines direct from Veronique. Like all wines that are on what's known as the Bordeaux Place, we buy through négociants, so merchants effectively based in Bordeaux. And I might buy Veronique's wines from 10 different merchants in order to get enough stock to satisfy demand. But when you're buying from 10 different merchants, and then some of them you're buying full bottles and some half bottles and some magnums, it does get exceedingly complicated, particularly as we warehouse all our own wines. So at the moment, we only offer a limited number of bottles and half bottles, I'm afraid. If the systems change, and obviously with the building of a new warehouse number 5, we might be able to be more flexible, but at the moment, I'm afraid we can't be. So I think it's unlikely we'll be offering HautBailly 2 in half bottles, I'm afraid.
No problem. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Veronique. We've had quite a few questions. A lot of members were very interested to hear about the very beginning of your presentation, Veronique, and the blending. I think Mervyn Parry has summed it up perfectly. With a blend of the 6 varieties, and he said a field blend, and more than one picking, are the grapes vinified together, or are they in batches, or do you vinify the different varieties separately?
So when my grandfather was harvesting everything at once, of course it was vinified together. But since 2000, as we harvest separately, we vinify separately. And we blend it again when we do the blend for all of it. So basically in April, May, 6 months later after the harvest. So we vinify separately.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've had a few members ask about, viticulture in general. So I'll group a couple of questions together if it's all right, Veronique, because a lot of people are interested in hearing about what problems you have in the vineyard. So whether you are able to farm organically, I know it's often a challenge in Bordeaux, and whether you have had any issues this year with frost as well.
Well, it's extremely important to work as clean as we can. And HautBailly has a particularity: we never ever used any weed killers. So our soils are completely free of weed killers, which is fabulous. Of course, we've always plowed the soils, always worked that way. We did lots of tests, organic and biodynamic, during almost 10 years. We are working now in the third way to try to be even better, dealing also with the problem of copper. We made lots of studies and we realized that the copper of the 19th centuries had still not be absorbed in our soils. So we are actually at the moment searching a third way in order to do even better. And regarding the frost, this is something strange because HautBailly has never been sensitive to frost, being on a hillock. So basically we were concerned every 30 years, and we had frost in 91. We had a little bit of frost in 2017, but since 2017, every year we had to fight the frost during many nights. So last year we even bought some wind machine in order to help us. We are trying to warm everything with candles and everything. But even us, not sensitive to frost, 5 years in a row, we had to fight frost. And unfortunately, we were badly hit in 2021. It was not a white frost, but a black frost, and with lots of wind. And the wind was really killing wind. And unfortunately, we were damaged again in 2021. So yes, frost, we have the feeling that I'm never talking about global warming, but I'm talking about climate change. We really notice more extreme weather. I don't know where we go, but we notice that clearly.
Thank you. And for my benefit, what is it about HautBailly that is less susceptible to frost? Is it position, old vines? What has made you fortunate up until quite recently?
You mean regarding the terroir?
Yes, exactly. What is it about HautBailly that has compared to perhaps other neighbours, further upriver in Bordeaux? What's made you able to be less susceptible to frost?
Being located on a hillock is definitely an advantage. Except this year, because on a hillock you always have some wind, which is very good. When you have rain during the harvest, it dries out your berries. But this year the wind was killing, so it didn't help. But yes, the terroir of HautBailly really is fantastic, I have to say. And not only for frost.
On the point of terroir, actually, George Cox has asked that, bearing in mind that Pessac Léognan is known for producing some of the best whites of Bordeaux, is there a white wine, or has there ever been a white wine from HautBailly?
Very good question. That's a question which is often asked in competition, actually. We don't have a white wine at HautBailly, but we actually did produce a white wine in the 18th century. So, and probably also, I saw a few bottles at the beginning of the 20th century. But the terroir of HautBailly, I checked it several times. We digged everywhere to check the soil, the subsoil and everything. It's really a red wine terroir. So if a very nice neighbor gives me a beautiful white plots, I would be more than happy to make some white, but so far it's not possible.
Thank you. Fingers crossed a nice neighbor might be listening in, Veronique. That would be really, really special. And that actually leads quite nicely onto a question from Victoria, who has asked, is there something that you would like to try in the vineyard or the winery that you and your team haven't tried before?
That's a good question. And I'm happy you ask it, because I'm happy also to, of course, there's plenty of things we'd like to do, to try, to taste, and it shows probably the dynamism of Bordeaux. In the past, Bordeaux might have had the image of being, less dynamic or less able to change. I'm fascinated by what is happening today in Bordeaux, where you have every single property tasting lots of different things, moving, thinking with dedicated teams, completely passionate and trained. And yes, we have big challenges of course, and especially in the vineyard. And the first challenge is to adapt ourselves to the climatic condition. We discussed earlier the new cellar, and that was actually phase 2 of our big project called HautBailly Tomorrow, the HautBailly of Tomorrow. Phase 1 was actually a big study, a big research about the vineyard itself. And we digged everywhere. We made a very, very detailed map in order to know exactly what we need to change to adapt ourselves to the climatic condition. And there's lots of thinkings. Every day we have discussion with my team with new ideas, etc., etc. So it's a permanent evolution. And every year we start from scratch with a new white page, and every year we try to adapt to the new challenges. So it is what makes our job fascinating,
Absolutely. That sort of leads me on to a question. I know that members in the past have commented, Tim, you wrote a fantastic piece for the website on grape varieties with the changing climatic conditions in Bordeaux. Do you have any plans, Veronique, to adapt the grape varieties that you grow? And Ian John specifically has asked about the role of Cabernet Franc in the future of HautBailly.
I think you will for sure. I will talk about the left bank, if you don't mind. So Médoc and Grave. I am sure that there will be a tendency for planting more Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon resists much better to the heat than Merlot. Regarding Cabernet Franc, it's a different story, because the Cabernet Franc of the right bank, which are beautiful, are not the same as the Cabernet Franc that we have in the Grave. The Cabernet Franc we have in the Grave, we don't use it every year in the blend because it brings lots of finesse, but sometimes it lacks of density of something. So we have actually less and less Cabernet Franc. We replaced it partly by some Petit Verdot, which are very interesting, and it's great to use Petit Verdot in very warm vintage. So it's definitely something we will use a bit more than in the past. I'm talking about 4%, so that's not much. But definitely the biggest trend, I think, will be to have more Cabernet Sauvignon. And don't forget that the vineyard of Bordeaux always adapted itself to the climate. I'm sure you all know that in the 70s, Bordeaux was mostly planted with white wines and not red wines. And if you go back a century, it was mostly Malbec. So it's not something new. It has always been this adaptation of Bordeaux.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions around en primeur, and I don't want to sort of stay on the subject too long because they are slightly more generic questions. But Tim or Veronique, whichever, that we have had a question about why we as a retailer don't buy wine from Veronique directly. So Tim, would you possibly be able to give a sentence or two on the system?
Yes, I mean, it is quite complex. I mean, the obvious thing to do would be to just send Veronique out orders and for her to supply the wines. But historically, the chateaus have focused on making wine and not selling wine. They don't have huge teams of people selling their wines across the world. Bordeaux has been incredibly successful at selling its wines globally, and that's because there is a massive network of people who are working on behalf of the chateaus. So I don't know how many négociants or merchants HautBailly works with, but I would imagine it's probably 40 or 50 or maybe even more. So that means that there are merchants working on Veronique and HautBailly's behalf to make a decent kind of distribution across the globe. No chateau, well, there's one or two chateaus that don't work on the Place, but the vast majority of them do work on the Bordeaux Place, working through these négociants. But it does mean that you get a very bureaucratic and stratified, should we say, overall view of the market, and you get you get your chateau. The chateau doesn't sell direct to the merchant. The chateau sells to the merchant or the négociant via a courtier, which is a broker, so who takes their, I don't know, 2% or whatever it is. Veronique will be able to confirm it. But and then obviously, the importer takes the wine, and if that importer is a wholesaler rather than a retailer, will sell to a retailer. So you can see there are an awful lot of layers involved, but generally it has worked over the years. I'm sure you've got plenty to add, Veronique.
Well, I think the initial concept is a beautiful concept. We don't, in the chateau, we didn't have any sales force. It was externalisé, it was outside, in order to let us focus on the production. So basically our role is to produce the best wine as possible. And we have the négociants, which are the merchants, who are supposed to sell it all over the world. And they do a fantastic job, because last year, if I look at last year, we were sold in more than 50 countries. Everything was sold out in 30 minutes. If I need to have a sales force as big as a négoce, I would need to hire at least 20 people tomorrow, And I think for you, it's probably also a better way to, if you would buy direct, the costs of transport, of everything would be higher. You can consolidate your buyings, and you can have your Mouton, your Lafite, your Latour, HautBailly, all that sent at the same time, and you rationalize the cost. So I think for the consumer, it makes more sense. Of course, as Chateau, we have less margin, but the sales force, which is specialized, is doing a fantastic job. And if I'm just thinking of what happened recently with Brexit, when I listened to the négociants and telling us the problem they had to send wines to England, I'm so happy we don't sell direct. So it's really a specialization. And all this time, we don't need to spend on the administrative aspect. We can spend on the strategy in the vineyard, on doing the best wine as possible.
I think it's also worth saying, Veronique, that the way the structure, the way the market is structured, you get a lot of chateaus that in the past were totally isolated and divorced from the end consumer. A lot of chateaus had the philosophy that as long as they sold everything to the négociant, then they were happy. But I think, Veronique, you particularly are an exception to that, because for years you have been coming to the UK market, and I'm sure other markets as well, and you've been putting in an awful lot of spade work in developing relationships with UK consumers and UK merchants. And I think when you started doing that, that was very rare. And nowadays you get more chateaus doing what you've been doing for the last 25 years.
Yes, I think it's extremely important to meet people who love wine, to share our passion. We are lucky to produce something that is about civilization, about family, friends, about sharing. I'm fascinated to see how strong wine was, how important was wine during lockdown all over the world. And you realize that's something you like to enjoy, you know, and spend time with. So for us, it's a privilege to be able to meet the consumers. And the system, the distribution is frustrating because we don't always have the chance to know all of you. But if you make the effort, which is not an effort, it's a pleasure, to travel a bit and meet you. I remember the last dinner you organized, it was a beautiful dinner, do you remember, or the Haut-Bailly Clémence dinner, and it's a dear memory for me.
And for us too, Veronique. But it's lovely to, you know, be able to have you here this evening and have so many members enjoy your time. So one benefit of lockdown, not only people enjoying wine, but being able to hear from you, albeit virtually. Now, I hope you don't mind if I try and squeeze in 2 more questions. One, we could probably debate all evening, so I will ask for a shortish answer. We've had a member ask for your opinions on the 1855 classification, both of your opinions, and if it should be revisited. So Veronique, if I could maybe start with you.
That's a good question. Of course, you know that the 1855 classification is the one of the Médoc and Sauternes. In the Grave, we are not concerned because our classification is from 1953. I think this classification, which was made to last only a few weeks, the time of the World Exhibition, is probably now a monument, and we should keep it. But you also all know that the market makes the classification. And the most important thing is the reaction of the market. So you have a new classification, which is made by the price level, by the law of offer and demand. So you have this monument, let's keep it, let's respect it. And everybody in this classification should be responsible for keeping its position or not. So it's an individual responsibility for me. Yes.
Thank you. And Tim, just a few of your thoughts, if we could.
Yes, I mean, I can't add a lot to what Veronique said. I mean, I think bearing in mind that the 1855 classification was based purely on the prices that the wines could command, it's amazing that today there are very few chateaux that underperform the level that they were classified in 1855. Very few indeed. I mean, there are a few that could do with promoting. I mean, you know, Parma, for example, is the one that springs to mind. But as Veronique said, the price that Parma commands is proportional to the quality of the wine. So whether it's classified as a second growth, a first growth, or a fourth growth, Parma gets the price that they deserve.
Exactly. And you have some chateaux which are second and they are priced as fifths, and some chateaux which are fifths and they act like second. So
fantastic, thank you. And a final question, Veronique, you've spoken about lockdown and enjoying wine, so it seems very fitting to hear a question from Victoria Austin, who has asked, what would be your desert island or lockdown drink? Your top wine.
That's a very good question. It could be a wine from my husband, if my husband is with me, but I have a little scene and I love port. So maybe a Quinta de Noval Nacional 94, it could be a great drink. I don't know. It's difficult.
Something nice and light for your desert island.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you. That really has been, I think, one of our best evenings. Veronique, you've been a pleasure to listen to. And Tim, thank you so much for guiding us through a real wonderful tour of the region, of the chateau. It has been an absolute pleasure. Members, I'll be following up tomorrow with some more information. We'll link to the website, the areas that Tim mentioned. And yes, so any information you've received this evening, you'll get in writing as well. But I'm off to go and top up my glass of this absolutely gorgeous wine. And so a thank you to members for joining us, for Tim and Gil behind the scenes, Tim for a glorious evening, but of course, most of all to you, Veronique. So I'll hand over to Tim for a final sign off. Yes,
thank you very much, Anna. Yes, massive thanks to Veronique. Always lovely to see you, Veronique. I hope I can see you in person very soon. Thank you to the behind the scenes members of the tasting team, and especially to Anna. I don't know if I should reveal this, but Anna is getting married at the weekend. This is her last event. So I shall raise a glass to you, Anna, as well as to Veronique. Santé.
Congratulations and best wishes.
Thank you. Santé.